So, hello everybody, and welcome across multiple time zones. Early this morning for some, and later for others, could be evening. But I'm so delighted to have Haviva Ner-David and Max Buckler from Bruchim today talking about Haviva's newest book, To Die in Secret. Max played an important role in Bruchim's founding. He called us up one day and said, "We really need an organization." And Lisa and I had been thinking about an organization for a long time. We had the framework for it. Max was there in the early days and really very instrumental in getting Bruchim off the ground. So I'm excited that Max is here and continuing to be part of our organization. And Max has now gone on to write essays for Jewish publications such as Evolve. And he's doing academic work on the topic of circumcision, which is wonderful. And of course, so delighted to welcome Haviva. Haviva was ordained as an Orthodox rabbi in 2006. I believe that was the first female Orthodox rabbi ordination. Is that correct, Haviva?
Well, publicly, to go public with it. Yeah, there were a few women before me who it was like a secret thing. Yeah.
Wow. Again, she was ordained in 2016 at One Spirit Interfaith Seminary in New York, where she studied both the ministry and spiritual companioning programs. Haviva calls herself a post-denominational interspiritual rabbi. Her specialties are mikveh, dream work, I love that, and spiritual companioning, often but not always combining all three. And we know that Haviva is a prolific writer. 3 spiritual journey memoirs and 2 novels, Hope Valley and To Die in Secret, and the only children's book about mikveh, Yonah and the mikveh fish. So don't have that book yet, but I am waiting for an opportunity to possibly read it to my daughter's Hebrew school class. So, thank you both so much for being here. Max, I'm going to turn things over to you and let you take it away from here.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yep. Huge honor for me to be interviewing Haviva. For those who might have heard, when I spoke on Judaism Unbound, when I talked about the way I see circumcision, a little bit in connection to the mikvah. It's like an inspiration on Jewish renewal and reform of certain traditional practices. My wife Charlene and I spoke about that. Haviva is someone who's been a leader in that movement surrounding the mikvah and a big inspiration way before I even thought about circumcision. So to be connecting on to talk about this book, just like I said, huge honor. So I'm really happy she's here. I thought what we could start is that we have a little bit of a mix of folks here. Some have already read the whole book, some are halfway through, some have not read the book yet. So I wanted to give Haviva a chance to just give a little bit of an idea of what we're going to be talking about today with To Die in Secret.
Okay, so I'll tell you what the premise of the book, what it's about, for those of you who haven't read it yet. So the book takes place in the the outskirts of Salem, Massachusetts, but we first meet Nomi, who's the protagonist of the book, when she's on an airplane going from Israel to Massachusetts for the first time in a little over 40 years. She grew up in Massachusetts in the suburbs of Boston, And she left right out of high school after a traumatic event that happened to her in her senior year of high school. And her parents were not supportive, and she heard that you could get a free ticket to go to Israel if you make Aliyah. So she went, and she pretty much ran away from home. This all happens before the book opens, and she goes to volunteer on a kibbutz. She ends up marrying a kibbutznik and staying on the kibbutz for those 40 years. And then her husband dies of COVID about 9 months or so before the book opens, and she hears that her sister and her nephew, so Nomi is I think she's 60 years old, her sister's 65. She finds out that her sister and her sister's only son, her nephew, were found dead in their farmhouse in the outskirts of Salem. So she goes back. So that's when we meet her, is when she's on the airplane going back. And the book takes place. The book is about the months that she's there after, when she arrives, and what happens to her in that time when she's going back. So she harbors resentment with her parents, and her father's not alive anymore. Her mother is in a nursing home, and she has dementia. And so there's also that of going back and seeing her mother for the first time in those 40 years. And so it's also about her getting to know her sister. She hadn't seen her sister all that time also. And so getting to know her sister through her house, through the people that she knew, through her clothing, through a book that she was reading that she left on the coffee table that she had been underlining extensively. So that's a big part of the book, is this whole idea that the sister's not alive anymore, and this is the way that Nomi can get to know her. And also there's the mystery of of what happened to her and her son, and how did they die. So that's at least what happens before the book opens. And then I guess one other thing to say is that to point out that she comes from a kibbutz. She's been living on a kibbutz all those years, so she doesn't own anything, and her husband's not alive anymore. She never had children. They never had children. And so when you first meet her, she really has nothing, and she's at this turning point in her life, which is an important, like dramatic kind of moment to meet her. And that was purposeful, on my part as the writer. So all options were kind of left open in many ways.
I mean, there's just so much in this story. You hear a little bit about it just in the premise, but I mean, this story interacts with COVID. It interacts with different kind of religions, and not just Jews, but there's Catholic characters. There's kind of a friendly biker gang character. So Nomi's going to meet go quite on a journey while she's in Salem. I guess like, even just to touch on what you said about where the story begins, or kind of like what's in there. I'm saying a story with like this much in it. I'm curious where, just as an author, you could tell us a little bit about your first idea for the story and when you started writing this book. And then, I thought we could talk a little bit about that, and then we just so everyone knows, we're gonna read a little bit a circumcision scene that's in the book and talk about that issue after that.
Okay, so I got the idea to write the book during COVID, and it's interesting because I remember during COVID reading an article that I don't remember where, saying that it would be many years before somebody would or should have a book take place during COVID. But I really felt that that's what I wanted this book to do. So I took a chance with that. And actually this summer, I read a book that takes place during COVID too, Lucy by the Sea by Elizabeth Strout. So I feel like affirmed that it was okay, because she's a well-known, writer. So, and it's a great book.
And another author who wrote a book about circumcision, who wrote an essay about circumcision in the New Yorker, Gary Steingart, who's interacted with Bruchim, also has a book about COVID. So
Really?
you're yeah, My Country Friends.
My Country Friends.
My Country Friends, which is a COVID book. So
I'm gonna write that. I'm writing that down. Great. So terrific. So anyway, so yeah, it was during COVID, and so a few things that happened during that time. One was a woman who I knew. I was taking an online course with her, and she lived in Israel, but I hadn't met her. I hadn't met her in person, but I took this course with her, and she was found dead, and I'm not gonna go into what happened in that story because that already gives away, if anybody hasn't read, like sort of gives away some of what happened, although the story's not the same. But what happened was it was very sudden and tragic death, and then I started to hear things about her afterward. I saw a photograph of her that really sits with me. I still have it. I'm not going to show it right now, but it was a picture of her sitting namaste gesture pose in her garden, and she was surrounded by her hair. She had cut off her hair, and the photograph, it was like it was a photograph that was taken not long before she died, and then there was a poem that some people said that she had been sending out to friends before also, and it was just like all these things that it was kind of mind-blowing, and so I had that story in my head, and it really sat with me. But as I said, I didn't really know her very well, and so I felt like I really wanted to get to know her more, and I was getting to know her through these things posthumously. So that idea of how someone could get to know somebody like that, after they die, that was very interesting to me, and I wanted to explore that in the book. And a few things. Another thing, one of my sons was struggling with mental illness at the time. He's doing much better, but that was something that definitely was very much on my mind, and that is a theme also that's explored in the book. Parenting in general, parenting in challenging times and challenging situations is a big theme in the book, and the book is dedicated to the good enough parents of the world. So that was a big impetus for me to write the book too. There's a lot of different parenting relationships that go on in the book. There's there's this diary that Jude, that Nomi's sister was reading and underlining, and that's of a woman who was in hiding with her son during the Shoah, during the Holocaust, in a very tiny crawl space. And so there's that relationship. There's Jude and her son Jonah. There's Nomi and her parents. There's Jude and her parents. There's Nomi's husband Avi, her late husband, whose parents have their own Holocaust trauma and raised him on a kibbutz in this in the time when children were in a separate children's house on the kibbutz, which also has its own complications and trauma. So there's that big theme, and that relates to circumcision as well, because I was exploring all these different ways in which parent relationships can be complex, even more complex than we think. And when we're making a quick decision about something, how that could affect our children. So that's another big theme in the book. Let's see, other things. And during COVID, so my husband, my spouse, my partner, whatever you want to call him, he was very sick, not from COVID, but during COVID, he was diagnosed with a very serious autoimmune disease. And so that time was very scary for me. From that point of view, spent a lot of time in the hospital, and so I was definitely imagining his death. I was imagining my own death because I have a muscular disease and I was high risk. So there was a lot of that imagining of death, and that's also a theme in the book, is like, how do you, when you lose a life partner, like how do you move on? Do you move on? Should you move on? What would your partner think if you took another partner? Like, so all those themes as well. I'm sure there's other things there were, but I don't know. I'm just looking, but yes, those were a lot of the things that pushed me to write the book. One more I'll say also was just this. When we meet Nomi, she's also between Israel and the United States. And that was a theme also that I really wanted to explore in the book, because my first novel takes place in Israel, called Valley, and it's a lot about the founding of Israel and the trauma that caused. And then when I was doing book talks, and it came out during COVID, and when I was doing book talks with people in the United States, I felt a lot of this kind of like energy of, oh, Israel has all these problems, and Israel did all these terrible things in its founding. And then I wanted to explore this idea of like a woman who had been living for a long time in Israel, and then goes back to the States and sees some of the things are not so different. There are similarities. And so I specifically chose to also look into colonial times in the Northeast, and Salem and the witch trials and all of that. And yeah, so a lot of things that I wanted to explore in the book, and that were the inspiration.
I definitely think that the sense of character with Nomi of being a little bit out of place in Israel, a little bit about out of place in America, comes through really clearly, and is something that when I read the book, really resonated, even with my little bit less Israel experience. But for those who haven't, ever been on a kibbutz or know a lot about it, like, the very rules-oriented kibbutz life that the character's coming from. Now, all of a sudden, she's dropped in an empty house. There's no guidance, and she's kind of just let loose. But to come back to the point you were saying about how it's a book that's very interested in death and in the challenges of illness and loss. These are themes that oftentimes connect very closely to religious ritual and life cycle. And I feel like that's why it's very natural that in the book there's a lot of different kind of religious ideology and heritage and faith really at the forefront. On that though, one of the things that really strikes me in this book is that we see this constant idea that religion can be a force of healing, when it comes to these very difficult issues, but it can also be a force for harm. And I think that relates a little bit very closely to the work of Bruchim. That's something that everyone's thinking about a good amount. So I just wondered if, not just about circumcision, but if that's something you could tell us a little bit more about, just like in your role as a rabbi, and in other ways, how you kind of see that challenge of religion. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not as good.
Yes, definitely. And it's something I struggle with personally as a rabbi, absolutely. And living here where I live, by the way, I live in Israel, and I've gone through my own crises of faith and crises about religion. In fact, the thing that made me decide to go to interfaith, interspiritual seminary was in the war in 2014 with Gaza. That summer, like, I really felt like I had to ask myself, is religion a positive force in the world? Can it be? Should it be? Like what? I really, so that was what made me decide to go to study. And I did find, my conclusion was that it can be. Religion definitely can often be a source of healing, of peace, of comfort, of community support, but it can also be, all those things have their flip side, so community can be oppressive. Religion can be healing, but it can also cause trauma. And so that comes through in the book, absolutely. And there are people who in the book who had suffered abuse, not always, somewhat in a religious context, some in more of a like Jewish, what would I say, like cultural context, and not just in Judaism. So there's the witch trials, which is this backdrop of the book. And interestingly, I was just for the first time in Salem this summer, because when I was writing the book, as I said, it was during COVID. And so I was back in the States. I just came back a week ago, and I got to go to these places for the first time that I had written about. And really, I had to rely a lot on the internet and photographs and videos. I took a video walking tour of Salem, online. But what was it? Yeah, so I was there in that place, and yeah. So religion, and with circumcision, as you were saying too, like it can be seen, as this. As sometimes some people see it as maybe the most important like ritual in Judaism, and some people could see it as maybe the most harmful one. So everything has its flip side, and even the kernel of it in it. Like I was thinking about the yin yang theory also, or of this, this idea that each side, has like a piece of the other side in it as well. So I think one thing I just want to say about that too is that I think part of it is also about like taking anything to its extreme, or placing like the sacredness of the thing in the thing itself and not in like the meaning behind it, so that it becomes like idolatry, really, which is what we're not supposed to be doing. So that if we hold the thing itself, so like if we were to find that something actually is harmful, and then to insist on continuing to do it because it's about like the shell of the thing and not what the meaning is that we're trying to impart with it. Yeah, so
that's such a great insight. I guess from there it makes sense to you're gonna do a great treat for us, which is actually reading from a little bit from the book. I know you prepared the scene of the bris scene, and I just wanted to know if you wanted to fill everyone in a little bit on the context of the story, because this is actually something that happens really close to the end of the book, and everyone might benefit from the context.
So yeah, I'll tell about what's happening here, and I'll also maybe say that that in the writing of the book, so I didn't go into the book thinking, oh, I'm going to write a brief scene. And in general, when I'm writing, I mean, I've only done 2 novels, but with both of them, I had the idea of the story, the kernel of it, I had the characters, but I didn't know everything that was going to happen. I didn't map it all out, and I just like let the characters live this story. And so I didn't imagine this brief scene, but there's a woman that that Naomi ends up befriending, in a very well, maybe, I mean, yes, I don't know how much I'll give away, but she ends up bringing this young woman into her home, into Jude's home, and well, I guess I have to say, so Ruth is a pregnant teenager, the woman that she meets, and then Ruth gives birth and has the baby. And there's this Ruth and Naomi thing going on there, if you're aware of the biblical story. But I'll say that is that I didn't plan to do the scene necessarily. And then one day when I was writing, and then she has the baby, and I'm like, oh, okay, she has the baby. And I don't remember what, I think I knew it was going to be a male baby. And for various reasons, and that's what happened. And so she has the baby, and I'm like, oh, she has the baby. Are they going to do a brit? Ruth grew up in a Chabad home, in a Lubavitcher Hasidic home, and so that was definitely something that would have been considered. So I wrote the scene, and then I finished the scene, and I'll say, so in the original writing of the scene, she goes ahead and does the circumcision. And then I finished writing the scene. I went, and I think, as I was telling Max before, I think I went to swim, which is when I do most of my thinking. And I realized while I was swimming that no, Ruth would not have gone through with doing the circumcision. So I went back and rewrote the scene, and then I felt like it was like not only would Ruth not have done it, but that was like central to the book, and it just and I couldn't believe that I had written it the other way. And one of the reasons I think, and so then I'll read it, is also I'll share some of my own stories. So I have 7 children. 3 are boys, 4 are girls, and it was something I definitely considered not doing circumcision when I had the boys. For the girls, my first was a girl, and then I had this whole dilemma of like, oh, what am I going to do if we're not doing circumcision? And I created this whole ceremony using mikveh, and that's based on a midrash by the Meiri. It's called a medieval scholar who said that when Abraham went and did his Brit Milah, his circumcision, his wife Sarai went to the mikveh, or immersed in the mikveh. So we did that. Then my next one was a boy, and I definitely considered not doing it. I spoke to my partner about it, and he was like, there's no way we're not doing it, just for so many reasons, like his own feelings, but also our parents. Like it was just, he said, I've gone ahead with like a lot of the crazy things you want to do, but this would like just be, like don't even start with it. So we did it. One thing nice is that we also, because I had already had the girl and done the mikveh thing, so so we and other things, like we brought in a lot of embellishments and beautiful readings and all this stuff. So we did that with the boy too, and so that was I felt like was a real gift from having to think of what we did want to do with the girl. But then I had him, and then we had another boy a few down later, and then our second to last child was adopted, which is also something maybe I'll have a chance to say something about. And maybe I'll make a note to myself 1 second. And we can only they said we had to do the circumcision for him. He was not born Jewish. We had to do it because we had to convert him in Israel in order to adopt him. It was a whole other story. But so it wasn't a question, like in order to adopt him, we had to do the circumcision, but by the time they allowed us to do it, he was already 2 years old. And he became whatever. It wasn't a pleasant experience. He had an infection. It was really awful. And so after that, I was like, no, like if I wasn't going to, I do have another one after that. She was a girl. So actually, if she had been a boy, that would have been a really interesting conversation between me and Jacob that time. So that's my personal circumcision story. But also, I, as a spiritual companion and as a rabbi, I do now. I have advised people on what to do with this, and I wouldn't say advise. I've been the spiritual companion to people when they're making this decision, and so I've talked to a lot of people through it, and I do feel like it's a very personal decision, which we can talk about more. But it's very important to me to present it all as these are all options, like you can do it, you cannot do it, of course it's not only about your own, it's not only always all about you. Sometimes it can also be about if your spouse doesn't agree, your partner, or if your parents, or there's a lot of people that get involved in this decision, but it's something definitely to discuss. So it shouldn't be a fait accompli, as which is often the case. Okay. So I'm just going to read part of this scene, and do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just before you jump into the scene, I just want to say, comment a little bit on what you just said, is that just the ability to discuss this issue is actually something that's very, very challenging in our communities. And I'm sure that's something that comes up with the families that you consult. So part of the work in Bruchim is really just like elevating the conversation and being able to talk about it. So I just wanted to note that on your comment.
Yeah, and I also help people with figuring out their marriage ceremonies, which can be very loaded. Like ritual in general, ceremony in general, especially when you're dealing with traditional culture. So I'll just say that at the end of the scene, I changed a little bit for reading purposes now, just because I don't want to give away something. Okay. And also, they call it a brit, but really brit is not. It's the milah part, the circumcision. It's not the covenant part, but this is because in the dialogue they would have called it a brit, so that's why I use that term. But really, I make the distinction between the brit and the milah, the covenantal ceremony part and the circumcision part. Okay. So this is he is Ruth's father is a Chabad rabbi, and so the sentence starts with he, but I'm talking about him. I'll just say Ruth's father. Okay. Ruth's father went over to Nomi and held his hands out for the baby. Nomi looked at Ruth, waiting for her approval. Ruth took the baby and transferred him to her father's arms. He scanned the room. Where should we do it? We need a good, stable chair. He stood and took his bag from the table. Nomi led them to the dining room and pulled out a chair from the head of the table. It was heavy and had armrests and a sturdy back. Yes, that will do just fine, Ruth's father said. Now for the cushion, for a cushion. Nomi took a seat cushion from one of the other chairs and gave it to the rabbi. We're ready then, he said. Wait. Ruth grabbed the baby from her father, who was too startled to react. The baby opened his eyes, woken by his mother's fear. I'm having second thoughts. Nomi was slightly startled. Then she sighed. I thought you wanted this, Ruth. I wouldn't have asked your father to come if I didn't know you wanted a brit. I'm scared. Are you sure it's okay? He's only 8 days old. Can't we wait a little longer? Nomi looked at the rabbi. Of course not, Mamala, he said. You know that. What's gotten into you? Now is the time. Since Avram Avinu, Jews have been circumcising their baby boys. On the 8th day, all Jewish mothers get through it. You'll manage too. I'm sure you're brave enough. I don't know. Before it seemed like the right thing to do, but I just don't know. Of course you know. It's not even a question. He opened the clasp on his bag. I can't do it. I just can't. She clutched the baby close to her chest. It's barbaric. What's the point? Ruti, the rabbi's face was turning pink. How dare you use that word about a mitzvah? Really, Tata, what will happen if I don't do it? Isn't there a better way to show my faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu? I don't believe this is what Hashem wants me to do. The rabbi's face was red now. Of course it is. It's in the Torah. It's a commandment. It's not for us to ask why. He was spitting out his words, just gesticulating with his arms. But hadn't he told Nomi life was a partnership between the divine and humanity, like the Star of David? Remember what happened when Moshe Rabbeinu hesitated to give his son a bris, the rabbi scolded. Nomi remembered that story from Hebrew school. Tzipporah, the Midianite wife of Moses, her father Jethro was a pagan priest, jumped in to circumcise their firstborn son in Moses' stead. I guess I'm not as brave as Tzipporah, Tate. On the contrary, Nomi knew Ruth was the epitome of bravery, especially standing up to her father this way. But Nomi was on the rabbi's side. She had summoned him. Circumcision was sacred. Ruth was a priestess like Tzipporah. Shouldn't she of all people want to perform this rite on her son? Here, give me my grandson, he said, stretching out his arms to take the baby. No one's asking you to do it yourself. You don't even have to watch. You can go to the other room. Slowly and hesitantly, Ruth held her arms out to her father with the baby, who was crying now from the commotion. No, I won't do that. If you're going to cut my baby, the least I can do is stay here with him. Nomi remembered what Ruth had said about not abandoning her child. She was not only brave, she was a parachute. That refers to something. She would have her son's back. The rabbi took the baby and gave him a kiss on the forehead, like he had to Ruth when he came in. The baby calmed down. We need a sandak, he said, and turned to Nomi. You'll have to do. He handed her the baby. Nomi knew he meant because she was not a man, but he did not silence, shame, or oust her for being a woman. Ruth was right. He was a complex human, not as narrow as he appeared to be, and more flexible too. Ruth had said he was both strict and soft. You hold him while I cut. Nomi took the baby in her arms and sat on the designated chair. She watched as the rabbi recited the blessing in a sing-song. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al hamilah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning circumcision. Ruth covered her eyes, but Nomi did not even turn away. She watched the rabbi examine his scalpel and put his finger to the blade to check its sharpness. The baby had gone back to sleep. So innocent, so vulnerable. In a moment, he would be shocked out of his bliss, the first of many hurts, wounds, and scars for the rest of his life. Might as well start now. But just as Ruth's father was about to cut, she, like the biblical Abraham's angel, swooped in, grabbed the rabbi's arm, took the knife from his hand, and threw it to the floor. No, Tata, you will not cut my child. Then, reversing Tzipporah's act thousands of years ago, she took her baby in her arms and covered his face with kisses and tears. Ruth's father, as if in a trance, continued with the ceremony, but without the cutting. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu b'brito shel Avraham Avinu. Blessed are you, Lord of our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us with the covenant of Abraham, our father. He was crying. The rabbi passed a prayer book to his daughter and pointed to the line she was to say next. Ruth gently pushed the book away and recited from memory, but with feminine God language. Bruchat ya ruach haolam shechianu v'kimanu v'gianu lazman hazeh. Thanking a feminine God for bringing them to this moment. Then she took the book from her father and held it in front of Nomi for her to read. Keshem shenichnas labrit ken yikanes leTorah lechupha ulemasim tovim, Nomi recited. Just as this baby has entered the covenant, so may he enter Torah, marriage, and good deeds. Ruth's father then recited a few more lines in Hebrew, barely audible because of his weeping, and turned to Ruth. Ukra Shmo Yisrael, what is his name? He blurted out. Abraham, Ruth said, looking at Nomi. That was Nomi's husband. Nomi was moved beyond words. She brought both mother and baby into a bear hug. Avi, who himself had been named for his uncle, murdered by the Nazis when he was only a baby. Wait. And the name of his name and the name of his biblical namesake, who not only cut his son's flesh, but cut his own too, in the name of God, belonged on this not yet wounded child. There would be time for that, but at least it could be done without intention. So that's the end of the scene. Yeah, so that idea of wounding, also I'm thinking as I just read the last line, when I said I was dealing with this issue of parenting and you know, we all wound our children inevitably, which is definitely a theme in the book, and I can attest to that. But this question of like doing it intentionally, not intentionally, as part of a ritual, was in my mind when I wrote the scene. Yeah.
It's amazing, and thank you so much for reading it for us. And you know, I think that what you've just said at the end really gets to a kernel of the truth in these you know, lowercase t truth in these conversations, which is about that intentional harming versus unintentional, which, you know, in my own writing in Jewish spaces, I've tried to press to have high honesty conversations or something. And I think, you know, that's one that's really relevant to this topic, because it's very, of course, naive to think you can protect your children from all the difficulty in the world. But, you know, what do we do while we are responsible for them and when we have the power? So that's also something that really resonated with me when I first read it, and I appreciate you bringing it up now. I prepared a couple talking points for you to talk about like the circumcision aspects of this, like, and so for everyone listening, you know, this scene happens really at the end of the book. It's kind of a major point for Ruth's character at the end of the book. So I find it very important in the story in my reading. And I had some thoughts about what I'd be curious to know from Haviva. One of the things in the bris scene, and I think would be familiar to people who've thought about this issue, is that the grandfather, the rabbi in the scene, really views the bris as like an act of giving and kindness and connection for the baby and as a good thing. And just tying circumcision specifically back to something we discussed at the end of the talk, like how do we relate to these situations when one person thinks that what they're doing is a good thing and another person who's even receiving it sees it as a harmful thing? And how do you see that interacting with circumcision, like in Jewish communities, you know, in the States and in Israel, I guess?
Well, that was definitely, yeah, I think that's what I was saying before about like, yeah, some people might even see that as like the epitome of Judaism. I think it's one reason why people have such a hard time thinking about not doing it and don't even want to talk about it and say like, it's not even something to discuss, you just have to do it. Mm-hmm. Now that I'm saying that, I think it also kind of takes advantage of the vulnerability. I've never said this before, but it just occurred to me, the vulnerability of the parents too, like in that very that time in their life where they've just had this baby and things are kind of fuzzy anyway, and you know, and it's sort of just like, just do what everyone does, and you don't have a lot of time to think about it, not like a wedding where you can be planning it for a long time, but it's all very spur of the moment, and it's hard to even plan the whole thing as it is and pull it all together, and there's this time pressure, right? Because it has to be done on the 8th day unless you get some rabbi to say you can wait because of health reasons, but it's yeah, I just was thinking about that. I assume that that's something that's come up where you've thought about because you're in this work. And I know even I felt when I'm counseling people on it, or because they feel like they need to make this decision really, really quickly, and there's the pressures from all the different people who, for them, it can just, that's like so important, so loaded, and it represents, it's the covenant. That's what the Brit part is, right? So if you don't connect Brit and Milah, if you don't connect the covenant part and the circumcision part and say they have to go together, then you're talking about the thing that's about the covenantal relationship with God, and so yeah.
Sometimes it's hard to look between like harms where like when someone's insisting something is a good thing, or like I think this week an article came out in the Jerusalem Post saying, oh, some people think that circumcision is against human rights, but actually from a Jewish perspective, circumcision is a human right. And that's what the author of this article is saying. So it's kind of like no one's, if you can't agree on what counts as a harm, then sometimes that leads to a lot of challenges in these type of very intimate situations. But related, and I mean, this wasn't in the scene, but then I think this comes in almost at the very end of the book, and I don't think this is a spoiler. But Naomi describes Ruth's decision not to circumcise the baby as specifically as breaking the cycle. And I wonder if you could tell a little bit about that passage, because it seemed to me when I read it that she's talking about breaking the cycle. It's not just about circumcision. It seems to represent something bigger about Judaism, or maybe about relationships. Is that something you could tell me a little bit about, or is that something that you factored in?
Well, so the breaking the cycle, I had in mind the cycle of trauma, of causing trauma, and not only from religion or culture or collective trauma, so also individual trauma, also collective trauma, and this cycle of just doing things because that's what's been done before, so perpetuating certain things that perhaps are not helpful and that could be harmful, but just doing it because that's the tradition. So and this cycle of wounding, and being wounded, as I said, like we all, I do think that in parenting, that's built into parenting, is this idea that we're going to inevitably wound our children. And in fact, I can share a positive thing that I think that's even part of what's like supposed to happen kind of when you're parenting, because then the individual, the child, can separate, or can become who they're meant to be. And often it's based on things in ways in which we were wounded, then sometimes we become our own person in the world and have to do the work that we're meant to be doing in the world. But as I said, there's a difference between the wounding that's intentional or even abusive, and wounding that's not, and that's just part of two human beings being in relationship with each other. And of course, some people are going to get hurt sometimes, and that's just the way that it is. And so it's, this idea of there's this thing you have to do, and you can't even think about it because it's just what has to be done. That is problematic, I think, and it can be part of this cycle. Yeah. there's more to, if there's anything more you want to say about
Oh,
it.
that's and that was so well said. I guess though that bridges perfectly to my last kind of question I had before I opened it up for anyone else's questions. But and I think this would actually be a fine discussion topic for everyone here. But in the story, Ruth stops the bris in the heat of the moment. It's like right before it's about to happen. So she doesn't have time to prepare like an alternative, like a brit milah or other type of ritual, which many people in this room have put a lot of their brain power into coming up with what's going to be kind of the way to sort of have a welcoming ceremony, have something that's has covenantal power without the circumcision. So this is something that you could talk about from the context of the book for the character of Ruth and Naomi, or even just from your own experience, what you see for these rituals for people like those that Bruchim serves who are abstaining from infant circumcision.
Yeah. And actually I also want to say that, and now I'm thinking that because in the book there's things having to do with gender also, and that it's not everything with these rituals is always about like physically harming someone or causing trauma, but even just other things like that I grew up in an Orthodox home, and just being a girl in an Orthodox home was definitely had its own, I don't know if I'd use the word trauma, but definitely challenging things to be a girl growing up in an Orthodox home. And so, wait, so the question, right. So I noticed when I was reading it aloud now also that she does do something. She puts in the blessing in the feminine God language, which in the context of the whole book, you see like that she's doing that. That's part of her character, Ruth, is that there are times before this scene and there's times after where she creates ritual, or where she takes a traditional ritual and either feminizes it or makes it more personal. So there's a Hanukkah candle lighting ceremony, there's a Shabbat candle ceremony. The end of the book, I'll even just throw out, and I won't tell about what it is, but there's an exorcism ceremony that she does. So that Ruth is somebody who does this work, and she's studying to be a Jewish priestess, it's called also. So,
and I love the line in the bris scene when it says Ruth was a priestess, like, and talking about her, and her power in that moment.
Exactly. And but that's interesting too, because Nomi's saying it to her as like, you should go ahead and do this ritual. You're a priestess, ritual is so important. And then it kind of turns it around, and she's like, she does something, but she doesn't do that. And so there's that moment where, right. So the father, I thought it was, I deliberated about that. Like, would this father have gone through with continuing the ceremony if he wasn't doing the cutting? Because then he's making this statement. He's saying, you've now entered the covenant of Abraham, even though he didn't do the circumcision. So I meant that to definitely be like this statement that this, like, it held, like it had its effect that it was supposed to have, even though they don't do the circumcising part. So that was definitely my intention. And the fact that then she changes, she creates this feminine, which is a theme in the book too throughout. Like Naomi is struggling with God. I mean, she's lost her husband, and she's struggling with grief and with how could God have done this? And that's a big question throughout the book. And some of the healing that comes around that is her reimagining God to be more womb-like and feminine, and compassionate. And so that is, you get that in the context of the book when you get to this point. But also because Ruth is somebody who is creating ritual throughout, and also what's the word, like embellishing or changing or traditional rituals, you're supposed to kind of like assume that if this hadn't been in the spur of the moment, that yes, she's like definitely in favor of, if she had been given time, she would have probably created some other kind of alternative something to do. So yeah, that was definitely my intention in the book. And I think that's very important, as I think I said at the beginning too, right, with my, what I did. So with my daughter, Michal, my eldest one, it was very important to do some kind of embodied ritual, even though we weren't doing, I mean, obviously weren't circumcising her. And so we did this embodied water mikveh ritual. And I think I think it's very, I think embodied rituals are actually important, you know, so I think it's, I like the solution that we had of using mikvah or water or something that's on the body. And Judaism doesn't have so many embodied rituals, and so I think it's important to not do away with all embodied rituals. It's, you know, it's become a very cerebral kind of religion, and so one reason why I love mikvah. So I think it's also important to say that, you know, that we don't want to just say, oh, we don't want any embodied rituals, but they don't have to necessarily be hurting. So, and even as a mikvah, which is one little thing I just want to say, as a mikvah guide, as a mikvah rabbi, that's something I take into my mikvah work too, because we have babies in the mikvah, and we do conversions with babies. And as I said, I did also with my daughter. And it's very important to me always that the baby is not having a hard time, you know. So, and I always say to the parents, you know, we're going to do the first immersion, and if the baby's crying, you know, you tell me if we should stop, and one is enough, you know. It's very important to me that the mikveh part also not be traumatic for the baby, for the parents. Again, that would be like this idol worship, you know, that I said before, that it becomes like we need to get this done the right way, and it needs. Whereas really, the whole thing is about the meaning of it. It's about having a ritual that's a transformative ritual, that for the parents, for the baby, for the people all around, that they feel that something has happened, but something positive, you know. And so that's I hadn't thought of that before. The parallel between the baby in the mikveh and the baby circumcised.
And I absolutely agree with you about the power of embodied rituals, and even for something like circumcision. And I can tell you that even many people who opt out of doing a brit milah on a baby, like have no problem with circumcision itself if it's consensual. And, you know, we have situations where we have amazing stories and essays. I can send everyone of like trans men doing hatafat dam brit, which becomes part of you know, the gender identity as well as the Jewish identity. And so, like, the power of embodied rituals, even when they're, you know, can be very severe or something, can be even more powerful, you know, in my opinion, when you enter them informed and knowingly, and as a person who's taking it on for themselves. So, you know, I think that it's something to think about with embodied rituals, is that, like, even for circumcision, you know, because there are still many men who convert who consensually do circumcision, many in Israel. So just something just to add on to that point about the power of embodied rituals. But I think from there, I guess that's what I had written down. I think that you raised so many amazing insights. I just wanted to see whoever else in the chat, if there are questions, people can raise their hand or come in, and we could discuss more. I guess you know, I'm here for as long as people want to talk. So.
And actually, just what you just said, like, I want to add that some men actually find it very meaningful to do circumcision when they convert, you know, so, like, it's true that that point is taken. Mm-hmm.
I sometimes, well, okay, Max is coming. Here we go.
Oh, sorry. Was someone else? No. Okay. No, I was just gonna say, I mean, there are a lot of things I appreciate about the book. One, and you sort of touched on this earlier, was sort of ways that ideas of relating to Judaism dominated by the Holocaust are still really prominent in a lot of different Jewish communities and Jewish spaces. And I found, among other benefits of the book, really, really helpful to think through that. I mean, is that something that you were planning to write about, something that's been prominent in some of your other work, or something that more came out as you were working with these characters?
Well, in my first novel, definitely also, which takes place in Israel, and there's the trauma of the Holocaust, and that's very much in that book. And there's a Holocaust survivor in that book too. There's definitely one thing I want to say about this book. So, and you were giving me a chance to say the thing that I had written down to say.
Perfect.
That this issue with the parenting, and so Nomi doesn't have any children, and another thing that she struggles with throughout the book is, as you know, if you read it, that is this idea, like, does she regret not having children? Does she wish she had children? Was it a good thing not to have children, to not pass on trauma and not to cause abuse? And then, so one thing and then, I mean, I don't want to give a spoiler if anybody hasn't read the book, but there is this issue of like biological children and passing on your actually your genes, or that kind of legacy that's like your physical genetic legacy, versus like other reasons why you might want to have children. And so there's this refrain in the book of having someone to care for and having someone to care for you. So, and then in the book itself, this question of and there's Nomi and Ruth from the biblical Nomi and Ruth, and they're not actually related to each other, but they're kind of like a family. And this idea of creating family, can you create family not through a biological passing on your genetics? And because one of my children is adopted, so that's something that definitely I think about a lot. And for me, my experience has been that I don't feel any difference between my biological children and my adopted son. And I mean, he has his own story. I mean, his story is different than their story. So I'm not saying everything's the same, but I don't feel less committed to him as a parent or anything like that. And so so that was an important theme for me in the book. And so in terms of the Holocaust, right, like, what is the legacy that we want to pass on? And is it just about creating more Jews, with like the blood, Jewish blood, or is it more about values that we want to pass on? And that's and in creating family, are there different ways you can create a family that aren't about your blood connection? And is it more about the caring for somebody and taking care of somebody, even if you don't even officially adopt them, yeah. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's something I wanted to say. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I guess I should say, yes, the Shoah, the Holocaust, as being like the major trauma of the Jewish people right now, for sure, and the ways that it affects decisions, communal decisions on so many levels. As living in Israel is definitely a big thing that I grapple with. Another question?
Hi there. I have something to add and ask about. The scene with the father, I know that before the scene, Nomi decides to go to Shabbat services, and she's sitting behind a partition as a woman, and she recites the mourner's Kaddish and gets reprimanded by it. Later, she meets with the rabbi, the father, Ruth's father, and she is kind of put in her place by him about the fact that women are not supposed to say the mourner's Kaddish out loud. They can ask the rabbi to say it for them. So for me, there was a bit of a when the father accepted and continued without doing the circumcision, he continues the prayers in the covenant is respected for the baby. For me, that was a bit of a jump because it was hard to imagine the rabbi being okay with it. And I was wondering if you could speak to that from the perspective. So just to give you a little background, my son is almost 16, and my father-in-law had passed away when he was born. When my son was born, my father-in-law had passed. And I know that had my father-in-law been alive, I believe our challenges about keeping our son intact would have multiplied exponentially. I just have a feeling about that. But the anger that was projected towards me when we kept our son intact, and I always thought it was they were thinking that I became Jewish by choice and kind of fooled them, and like I wouldn't be raising my child Jewish, like sort of. This was never vocalized, but I just got this sense that they thought of me as faking it to marry my husband. And sorry, I'm getting emotional. So my children are now almost adults, and my daughter was recently shopping with some friends in, Rockport, Massachusetts. It's near the ocean. And she came home and she presented my son with a Star of David. And he was so touched, and he's been wearing it. And my kid's identity is very Jewish. But when I wrote a personal essay about keeping my son intact, I had to tell my mother-in-law that I was publishing it because I didn't think it was fair to her if she were to somehow find out about it. Because, I didn't quote her, but I speak about my in-laws' anger. And it was very, very painful because we're raising our children in a Jewish home to hear that she's still angry. She's still angry with us. So if you could speak to the decision to have the father, a Hasidic rabbi, accepting of his daughter. For me, that was a bit of a jump that was hard to resonate with. And if you had something to say about that, I would love to hear it.
Mm-hmm. So interesting, because just like I had to think through, like, would Ruth have gone through with the circumcision? I had to, or not think through, I mean, more like feel into, would this father have actually kept going with the ceremony if his daughter refused to do the circumcision part? And I just really felt that he would have kept going. I mean, there's a piece of me in all of the characters too, right? So maybe that was a piece of me coming through, writing him, but he's not the harder, he didn't, well, I can't give too much of the plot, but he is not the one who sent her out of the house, and he does have this soft side to him, as I said, and he's also from a Hasidic background, which is also can be a little more free-flowing. But I think a big part of it is also supposed to be his love for his daughter coming through, and being able to just be in that moment of just holding her in love, and stepping out of his rabbinical role. And I can also, now you're saying that too, that there's the story, I'll just say, like, you've read the book, and I guess a lot of other people here have too, that there's this, I mean, that Ruth was raped by her father's very close, like, benefactor. And I somewhat base that on a true story of a friend of mine who wrote Chabad and was raped by her father's close friend who was staying in the house, and her parents came to her support in that story, in that true story, and that really, really moved me. And so I think some of that was coming through in that scene of just the love of this father, like risking everything, risking his reputation, risking his benefit, the money and so, and coming to her support. So I think that was coming through in that whole scene, of him. And you're supposed to get a feeling from the book that he wants to stay in touch with her, and that he's planning to be there for her and for the baby. Whether there is any Chabad rabbi out there who would have actually done that, I don't know. But I feel like this character in this moment would have gone through with it, or at least maybe there's some wishful thinking in there too. And that's one good thing about fiction, is that you can make things happen that might not necessarily happen in real life, and it feels really good.
It is a good feeling. It is a beautiful way you wrote it. I just was wondering about it. Thank you. Thanks for sharing.
Could I also just share a feeling from that exact area, which is kind of that, and we see this sometimes with these conversations, that like a Chabad rabbi has a different outlook on it than especially like maybe a conservative rabbi. Sometimes we see that like conservative Jews are actually way tougher about this on how angry they'll be, rather than, and it's part of kind of the Chabad thing that they're like they'll kind of take whatever mitzvah they could get. It's and that's kind of the philosophy. So when I read that, I kind of, it's surprising, but I kind of get it, and I do think it speaks to the father character. But I totally hear what you're saying, Taryn. I mean, like all this, and he accepts it kind of, but he kind of accepts it in shock too. So that's just a little bit from my reading of that scene.
That's a really good point. I mean, he's definitely in shock, and maybe that's what helps him to be able to just like work from the heart, because he's shocked into it or whatever. And you're so right also about the Chabad. It's true. Like if you were a different kind of Hasidic, if you were, there's a lot of other sects or whatever, of Hasidic that are not as open-minded and all that. And so, like he might have also seen this as a way to hold on to his daughter in some way, so that he could still keep her in the fold somewhat, so even practically I could see that it could happen. And yes, things can happen in real life that we couldn't imagine in fiction. Is true. Like truth is stranger than fiction sometimes, for sure. Someone wrote that in the chat.